What happens when governments manage the money supply? Welcome to another episode of Understanding the Potential of Bitcoin according to Dr. Saifedean Ammous. He wrote this book, The Bitcoin Standard, the decentralized alternative to central banking. And in the back it says it is the essential guide to Bitcoin's history, properties, uses, and future. My name is Nikolai, and this is a very special episode. It's part 8, and it is actually the last one before we start talking about Bitcoin. So this is the last chapter in the book before he starts talking about digital money. So, well, congratulations if you've watched all the parts that far. I think you need a low time preference in order to go through all the parts, but I think it's very important. And we've covered quite some ground in the last couple of weeks. We thought about in the beginning how money works in general, what is money, how something becomes money, and then what primitive forms of money there were in history. And then we went through basically a historical look at the development of different monetary assets, and we looked at the development of monetary nationalism, government money. Then we took a look at the relationship between time preference, how much somebody values the future in relationship to the present, money and time preference. We talked about capital's information system. That was the last part where we looked at prices and realized that you can't just mess with prices without messing with the whole economy. And this now is the last chapter before he really gets into the question of why Bitcoin is a solution to all of the problems that he addressed, and also not only to the problems, but also goes back to a sound money system that we had with the gold standard in some areas. And this chapter in the book is called, so the last one before digital money, Sound Money and Individual Freedom. But when you read the chapter, I felt more it's about whether governments should manage the money supply and what kind of consequences it has if they do. So I think in the last couple parts we already listened to a lot of different consequences, and they are mostly negative, to what happens when a central agency has control over the money supply, what kind of repercussions that has on the society. And I feel like this chapter is just adding more consequences to it. And I just want to mention some of them because I thought there are relationships between the soundness of money and the well-being of a society that I didn't know of. And it's also directly connected to what role does the government play in managing money. So the first question he raises is the money supply in need for a government to manage it? And he then lists basically the big alternatives in economics, the different schools of economics that answer this question. And of course, the big supporter for managing the money supply by governments is the Keynesian view of economics, as he explains it. And this is the widespread paradigm that every big economic school is working on, and also pretty much every big government is running on. So he's saying, well, the idea between Keynesians, the idea of Keynesians and their economic thought is that government has to expand the money supply, and that is because the assumption is that the most important metric in determining the state of the economy is the level of aggregate spending across society. So according to the Keynesians' view of economics, spending is all important. You need a lot of spending. If you have spending, that incentivizes producers to create more products, and therefore they employ more workers, and you reach a full employment equilibrium. So that's the idea. If you spend more, then there's more production. If you have more production, you need more workers, and therefore everybody's employed, everybody's happy. And if there are problems with spending, because spending is the solution, of course you need a central agency that solves these problems and stimulates that aggregate spending. That's the idea behind it. And how can you stimulate the aggregate spending? Well, you can increase the money supply, you can increase government spending, or you can reduce taxes. Those are the three options. You can increase the money supply, you can increase government spending, or you can reduce taxing. Government spending, increase of government spending and increase of money supply is pretty much the same, as he explains later on. And the worst thing that can happen, according to Keynesian economics, as he explains it, I haven't read it myself, so I don't know. I just summarize what he says, is that money will be saved. So saving is absolutely evil. Keynes absolutely detested saving, as Dr. Ammous writes, because saving would reduce spending. In any way, he writes that the Keynesian holy grail is that whenever the economy is not at full employment, an increase of the money supply would fix the problem. Interestingly enough, he adds an important question here, that he says, well, if that is the case, then it would necessarily follow that there can be no example of a society experiencing high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. But of course that happened before, for example, in the United States in the 1970s. And then, okay, you have the Keynesian school of economics, and then he says you have the monetarist school of economics and the Austrian school of economics. So you have these big three. The Keynesians we just talked about. The monetarists, he says, they are basically just the battered wives of the Keynesians. And their intellectual father is Milton Friedman. So in this school, it's pretty much the same as in the Keynesian school, but the big difference is that monetarists prefer tax cuts to stimulate the economy. It's not so much about more government spending or increasing the money supply, but in the end, both policies result in increased government deficits, which can only be financed with monetized debt, effectively an increase in the money supply. So you can always increase the money supply by increasing the debt and increasing the government deficit. So for both of these schools, the Keynesian school and the monetary school, the worst thing that can happen is saving. And of course, you need more spending, and therefore what would be worse, what would happen if people save a lot is that you have deflation, a decline in the price level. And so that would result in people hoarding their money. So you need to always have some kind of inflation, right? Do you get that? So if the goal is for people to spend, then of course you cannot have the situation that money increases in value, because if it does, people are incentivized to save. When they save, because they will save because they know the money is more valuable in the future. But then when they save, they don't spend, and then no products are produced, and we have unemployment, and the world is about to end. So basically, the main goal, therefore, is that central banks must do everything possible to ensure that deflation never happens. Deflation is like the worst thing. And then he says, he quotes a speech by the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. So he's like he's the most important guy in the industry at that time, 2002. And he gave a speech entitled "Deflation: Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here." So you can see, and this is really interesting. I personally followed, because of trading, a lot of the European Central Bank decisions and Mario Draghi's speeches. And it's so interesting that the goal is always that the inflation needs to be higher than it currently is, right? We're in 2019, and they really worried about the inflation level. They're worried that the inflation is not high enough. They want it around 2%. And the problem is that if the inflation is not high enough, they can't do a lot to increase the value of the euro, because if they do, then of course, inflation will not increase, and therefore they are very, very conservative in taking any measures of fortifying and supporting any strength of the euro. But the whole idea behind this is we cannot have deflation, therefore we rather want inflation, because then people spend more, and yeah. So the central bank should be in the business of expanding the money supply at a controlled pace to encourage people to spend more and thus keep the unemployment level sufficiently low. And here, of course, if you listen to that whole argument, it's so interesting, because nobody in their personal life would live like that, right? Like nobody, you wouldn't tell your kids or your partner, hey, you should just spend more and everything will be fine. That sounds like a big joke. But basically, that's the whole theory that is running the central bank system today, that spending is the solution to everything. What does that lead to? Well, as he writes, we have a widespread culture of conspicuous consumption. Consumption, where people live their lives to buy ever larger quantities of crap they don't need. And so when the alternative to spending money is witnessing your savings lose value over time, you might as well enjoy spending it before it loses its value. That's the problem with inflation. When you look at it and you know, well, my money's not going to be worth a lot in the future, of course, I'm going to rather spend it right now, and you have a lot of consumption. What did we learn from the chapter of the relationship between money and time preference? Well, that this kind of unsound money policy leads to a high time preference of people in all aspects of life. The depreciating currency causes less saving and therefore more borrowing, more short-termism in economic production and in artistic and cultural endeavors. We learned about that, about innovations and all that going down, at least the innovations from 0 to 1, not the innovations from 1 to many. And then, of course, it goes as far as the depletion of the soil, of nutrients, leading to ever lower level of nutrients in the food. So this is widespread, and it's all connected to a high time preference lifestyle, and high time preference is encouraged by high inflation rates. So this is all connected, right? Then he presents the solution, the Austrian school of economics. And the Austrian theory of money is that it needs to emerge in a free market. So you cannot just say, well, this is supposed to be money, but money naturally, automatically emerges in a free market, and it is the most marketable commodity and the most saleable asset. So you can sell it with the most ease, that medium of exchange. That is what emerges as money. And it is, of course, something that holds its value well. Otherwise, people won't use it, because if you use it, then you're just going to get broke really fast. It's all connected to a network effect. And so therefore, you can only have one or a few assets as a media of, that can emerge as media of exchange. There are some intellectual fathers, Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard. The idea is, according to the Austrian view, that the money supply is fixed. Let that sink in. The money supply is fixed, and you can already hear Bitcoin in the back, fixed to 21 million, the cap. So that is going to be one of the big points for Bitcoin, that the money supply, the increase is fixed. And then if that is fixed, then economic growth will cause prices of real goods and services to drop. So you're going to have deflation if the prices, if the money supply is fixed. And that means that people are able to purchase increasing quantities of goods and services with their money in the future, right? They're going to save. But what about deflation? Aren't we just going to have, like, is everybody going to go broke? And of course not, he says, because, well, you still need things for today. No matter how low your time preference is, you're still going to die, and therefore you're going to need some consumption today. But what changes is that in such a world, immediate consumption is discouraged. So you have consumption, but not the immediate consumption of just crap. And of course, that spending issue is changed because increased savings impact on consumption in any present moment is more than outweighed by the increases in spending caused by the increased savings of the past. Okay, that's a little complicated, but what he's saying is that, of course, saving has an impact on the spending in the present, but it has also a huge impact on the spending in the future, and the spending on the future is going to be bigger if people save right now because they're just going to accumulate more capital. So in the end, the net total is going to be more spending than with the Keynesian view. The low time preference society invests more and thus produces more income for its members. When the value of money appreciates over time, people are likely to be far more discerning with their consumption and to save far more of their income for the future. Now, doesn't that sound like a bright idea and a very happy future? I think it does, because it's just how I think in a personal life you try to manage your money. Okay, well, that is the three schools that talk about how should the government be involved in managing the money supply, and we know the ones that are currently running the show. And now he's talking about some of the consequences this kind of policy or this kind of politics has for us as individuals and for our level of freedom, but also for our society in general. And one of the things he mentions, and I thought that was quite shocking, is the relationship between unsound money and perpetual war. So if governments are in a position to be able to manage the money supply, we're going to see a lot more war, and we're going to see longer wars. And it's no coincidence that the era of central bank controlled money was inaugurated with the First World War in human history, he writes. So there's a relationship between it. And he says, well, why is the relationship between unsound money, for those who just started watching the series, unsound money just means a money where you can increase the supply easily, and therefore everybody, the producers of the money, are in a big advantage, and everybody who uses the money for as a medium of exchange loses their whole wealth of everything they saved. So scarcity of the supply is really important. The stock to flow ratio needs to be high. So there needs to be very, very little new stuff coming in compared to the ones you already have in stock. So gold is a good example. You just have very, very little growth in the supply of gold, and therefore it's a sound money. You can't increase it easily. Therefore, it's a good store of value, and you can use it as a medium of exchange because you know it won't just change its value overnight. So what is the relationship between unsound money and war? And he names three relationships. Well, first, unsound money is itself a barrier to trade between countries. That's the situation we have right now. We have a huge foreign exchange markets. Trillions of dollars every day are exchanged just because we all have different currencies. And of course, if you have barriers to trade because of the currencies, that is a political issue, as we see right now. Trade wars going on, and those trade wars create animosity and enmity between governments and populations. So oftentimes, wars actually start far earlier than military conflicts by trade wars and the political consequences of that. Second reason why there is a relationship is because if the government has access to the printing press, it allows it to continue fighting until it completely destroys the value of its currency. So they can basically fight a lot longer. I will explain that later on in more detail why that is the case. But because they can print money, they're not limited to how much money they have right now. They are basically limited to the wealth of their whole population, because they can just increase the money supply and therefore inflate prices, and everything is going to get more expensive, and they're just going to do it as long as people are still using that money until in the end it all collapses. And the third reason is that when you have a high time preference, you are more inclined to think of conflict than of cooperation. That means if you are encouraged to spend a lot, your idea is, how can I get the most out of this thing right now? You're not going to think long term. And if you think long term, you're always going to find that cooperation is the way to go because it benefits both parties. Those are very much the three reasons that we have a 19th century Europe where on the gold standard we didn't have long wars, and it was very, very hard for the monarchs to just start a war because they had to tax the people before the war in order to finance their wars. Now think about what that does psychologically. If you need money for a war, right? But if you can't just print money because you don't have a printing press, you actually use gold for money, then in order to have more money to buy the military goods, you need to tax your people and you need to raise taxes. Well, in order to do that, you have to have a very, very good reason to go to war. You have to explain people why it makes sense to go to war. And oftentimes it doesn't actually make sense, and therefore monarchs would abstain from raising the taxes and think of a different solution. In the other hand, if you have a printing press, you don't need to talk to your population beforehand. You can just start a war and increase the deficit, inflate the currency, and people will pay the price later on for the war. But the war is always incredibly costly. So what happens is, for example, he says one of the major wars of the 19th century in Europe was the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. It only lasted 9 months and it killed around 150,000 people, which is a lot, but if you think about, this is only the average week's tally in World War II. So every week in average in World War II, 150,000 people were killed. And before that, that was the whole war, and it was limited to 9 months. What happened is, the one big war before the world wars that was very, very costly were the Napoleonic Wars. They lasted longer, but that was at a time when the gold standard was not formally adopted across the continent, and the French Revolution experimented with inflation. Interesting, right? That coincided again. He says, well, if you think about the taxation issue, of course a government would not likely under a gold standard go into an aggressive war. They would be more in the defense. They would not be offensive. Because why? Because you can always explain it in a more easy way to your population that you need money to defend your country. They will then pay the taxes. And by the way, if you raise the taxes too high, they will just revolt, which you had a lot of times, and then you have problems as a king. But if you say, well, we're going to have an offensive war, we're going to start war with somebody, then you need to explain to your population, well, why should they pay for that? And that is usually very, very hard. And of course, if you run out of money, you can't just keep printing money, but then you need to start negotiating. And that's what happened a lot of times. That's why these wars didn't last so long, because you would actually need to get into negotiations pretty quickly because you ran out of money. The situation today is completely different. You have a whole industry around war. You have warfare as a business in the United States. You have a defense spending that is equal to the rest of the planet combined. So only the United States has a defense budget for a year that the rest of the world has together. And of course there are a lot of firms involved, a lot of industry that have vested interest in keeping the US government involved in some form of military adventure, as he writes. And that is only possible because the government has the possibility to change the money supply. He then continues to talk about the role of government in general and how it is connected to its ability to print money. And He titles that part of the chapter Limited versus Omnipotent Government. And he says that basically our democracy today is totally ruined by the ability of government to change the money supply, because democracy has become a mass delusion of people attempting to override the rules of economics by voting themselves a free lunch. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that every politician promises big, like, free lunches, like big improvements, and we're going to change this, we're going to change that, but they're not telling people how they're going to pay for it. And they don't have to, because they have the possibility of inflating the money. But of course, in the end, everybody's going to pay for it. In a society of sound money, government is reliant on the consent of its population to finance its operation. That is a very, very different approach. They need the consent of its population. And every new proposal for government action will have to be paid up front in taxes or by the sale of long-term government bonds. And that gives the population an accurate measure of the true costs of this strategy. So I think that makes so much sense. If you can only spend the money you have, and if you don't have that money, you can't spend it. Unless you're in the seat of a central bank and you have the ability to print more money, which also always means that the wealth of the nation is going to decrease, because it's not going to be worth as much in the future as it is right now. So sound money enforces a measure of honesty and transparency of governments. That was true in relationship to the wars of the monarchs, but it's true in general in relationship to all the governments. So unsound money has eradicated the notion of trade-offs and opportunity costs from the mind of individuals thinking of public affairs. And I think that's very, very true, that to realize that everything is a trade-off, everything has opportunity costs, and nobody can just promise you a free lunch. Somebody has to pay for it. There are no free lunches in economics. Somebody has to pay for it. But we live in a world where the politicians can just promise pretty much everything, and people don't understand how this whole system works and how they can do this, or they believe they can do this somehow without them having to pay. And they do it very wisely, I would say, but very smart, very cleverly, by inflating the currency. And nobody really realized what's going on. And of course, they are gone after 4 or 6 years. So you can always say, well, it was the problem of the party that ruled beforehand. And then he says, every horrific tyrant of history, every single one, you find that they had operated under a system of government-issued money. So you had Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Hitler, Robespierre, Mussolini, Kim Jong-il, all of this. All of these monsters repealed sound money in order to fund their mass murder. And if you think about the Second World War era in Germany, of course, you had inflation rates that were insane in the end, which showed that the whole war was paid for by through the wealth of the whole population, until everything was just ruined and nobody had any wealth left. That was the cost of the war. So he says basically unsound money makes government power potentially unlimited. The potential power of government is directly related to their ability to mess with the supply of money. A democracy, republic, or monarchy are all restrained by sound money, allowing most individuals a large degree of freedom in their personal life. If you have sound money, the influence of government is not that big, cannot be that big, and that means more individual freedom. So, and then in the end, he just basically reiterates some consequences of the situation we have right now. And this is that in a time where government has the possibility to print money, you have a huge percentage of the economic activity in the modern world going into pursuing government printed money rather than the production of goods and services useful to society. So he says, well, usually you should not spend any time productive time trying to increase the supply of your medium of exchange, right? Because the medium of exchange is chosen exactly out of the reason that you cannot easily increase the supply. So no real effort should go into it. In gold, well, there's mining going on, but it's very, very hard work. It's not like millions of people everywhere in your country, they are saying, oh, when I'm going to grow up, I want to be a gold miner. No, because you know that no matter how hard you try, you can just always increase it a little tiny bit. But he says the situation we have right now is that a lot of people and a lot of economic activity in the modern world is going toward pursuing government printed money. A lot of people want to go into finance, a lot of people want to go into government agencies because there is a lot of money that can be made, and it's all made by the possibility of government changing the money supply. So you have the whole central bank system, you have firms that can get low interest rate credit to operate, and they have an advantage over competitors that cannot, and therefore everybody wants to get in. Then he talks about academia, how they are funded by government money, actually taxpayer money, but of course that changes academia, and he's really not so happy about it. He says the average academic paper is rarely ever read by anyone except the small circle of academics in each discipline who approve each other's grants. So the grants are sponsored mostly by governments, and therefore if you want to stay in that system, you need to write papers that please the people above you, but it's not about actually transferring knowledge, teaching, writing in a way that people understand, writing in a way that there is real discussion evolving. That's not the goal. The goal is to get another grant, and I can tell a story about that in the German academic system. So another sector is that, or another point is that the debates of academia are almost entirely irrelevant to the real world, and its journal articles are almost never read by anyone except the people who write them for job promotion purposes. That's a horrible situation, and he says, well, but it makes sense, because if you have somebody who can give you money, they can make up the rules, but the rules are then not based on competition, that the market chooses the best good, what is the most valuable for society, but they are just rules by bureaucrats sitting somewhere on the desk and making checklists what this grant proposal has to have in it. And then, of course, the whole banking sector is affected by it. Why do so many thousands and thousands of people want to go into the banking sector? Well, because they quickly realize that a central bank will pretty much always bail out the bank. Why? Because there is an excessive risk that a systemic crisis happens if a bank goes out of business. He explains that very well, I thought, that usually a bank should have a matching between their the money they have and their the people that lended the money need when they come. So there shouldn't be like a bank run scenario. That just shouldn't happen. The bank should have enough money, right? But in a situation right now, you have a maturity mismatching or fractional reserve banking, where banks can just lend out a lot more money than they actually have. So they're always scared of like some psychological crisis happening or a real recession and everybody coming wanting the money. So they need the guarantee from the central bank that they're going to bail them out. So pretty much a bank right now can do very much whatever they want. They cannot really go out of business, and that's of course great for a lot of people. They think it's not fun to work there, I think, but in that environment, I don't mean in general, but in an environment where you, but that systemic crisis pending is just a great scenario for knowing you have very, very high potential profits and you have very, very low risk. There's very low risk in banking right now. Therefore, a lot of people want to go in it. Usually a bank would just go out of business if it does a poor job. And a bank has a job in a world. And he says, well, the job is the safekeeping of assets as depositing and the matching of maturity and risk tolerance, right? That's a good job, and we'll probably also have that when we under a Bitcoin standard. But that's it. If you do poorly in the job a bank should do, then you just go out of business. That's what the market decides. But in our system today, it's all different with the central banks and the systemic crisis pending, and therefore this is just leading to a lot of people going into the pursuit of jobs that don't actually benefit the whole society, which is a problem. And then another last part are that a lot of times big firms or firms of larger size are prioritized over those with smaller size, because in security centralized credit, here says, in securing centralized credit, it appears quantitatively less risky to lend to large-scale lenders. The larger the firm, the more predictable the formula for its success. So in central bank system, it supposedly is less risky to lend to a large firm. So you have a lot of times very, very hard time as a small food producer against a fast food chain to get good credits, because they will just assume that the big one has better possibilities to give the money back. All right, that was the episode on, is it useful that governments manage the money supply? And this is the last chapter before we now get into chapter 8, which is part 9 of the series, digital money. And I hope you are excited. I am excited, and I'm very proud of all of us, 12 people who made it through this series until now, but it will get very exciting, and I think from now on we will realize that all of the things that he explained are kind of like the foundation, the backbone for understanding the potential of Bitcoin. Have a great day, and I would be very happy if you recommend the series to your friends, colleagues, or whatever, so we get more discussion going. That is my aim, that I would love to hear some different voices. I would love to have some criticism. I would love to have some just people saying, well, this is exactly true out of my experience, all of that, but that can only happen if we have some more people watching it. So I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good day. Bye.